Welcome, folks. We'll just give a couple more minutes until folks join. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday evening. Feel free to, for folks in the audience, feel free to put your name and city where you're, which state, city and state you're joining from. Love to see people around the country. Welcome, everybody. We'll give another minute until folks join. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday evening. Please feel free to drop your name and where you're joining from here in the chat. All right, we're gonna start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Miriam Sabaghi, and I'm the National Organizing Director at the National Iranian American Council. For those who are new, NIAC was formed 20 years ago, and we are the largest grassroots Iranian American organization with members in all 50 states and 14 chapters around the country, and our headquarters here in Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to advancing peace and diplomacy, equitable immigration, and civil rights. This event is co-hosted by NIAC and our coalition partners, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, NAPABA. Today, we're here to talk about the Rounds Amendment, which is an amendment in the Senate NDAA that imposes discriminatory restrictions on the purchase of agricultural property based solely on national heritage. Essentially, it's an alien land law that threatens our civil rights. But first, here's our background story about this coalition. We are comprised of 25 national and local organizations from around the country. When Texas Governor Greg Abbott in January of 2023 publicized his interest in passing an alien land law proposal in Texas, and others began to follow, NIAC quickly organized a regular biweekly roundtable to coordinate efforts to counter these discriminatory measures. This multi-ethnic coalition grew rapidly and produced several public letters to officials, coordinated public panel discussions, media outreach, and local protests and personal testimonies at hearings, as well as supporting litigation efforts. We're now fighting federal legislation, such as the Rounds Amendment that was inserted into the Senate NDAA this past summer. The urgent threat is that federal alien land law legislation may pass, and we have very little time to stop it. And if we don't stop it, it's going to become federal law in all 50 states. We're going to talk about the urgent actions that you can do now and lay the groundwork and long game for what you can do locally. The silver lining of all of this is that we formed a strong multi-ethnic coalition with a system in place to help combat all these alien land laws, both local and federal. And we've come a long way since January of 2023. I also want to acknowledge that there has been a surge of anti-Asian hate, including gun attacks against the AAPI community all over the United States. The Iranian American community has also been hurting over the past year with the crackdown against Iranian protesters in Iran fighting for their freedom. This week also marks the one-year anniversary of Mahsa Amini's killing. Today, for this discussion on alien land laws, we're delighted to have Representative Ji Yunwu of Texas, a Chinese American lawyer and politician who is a Democratic member of the Texas House of Representatives, proudly serving the people of District 137 since 2013. He was formerly a prosecutor for Harris County. Also joining us today is Joanna Durman, Director of the Anti-Profiling Civil Rights and National Security Program at AAJC. Edgar Chan, Policy Advisor at NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and Ryan Costello, the Policy Director at NIAC, the National Iranian American Council. Another cool fact about our coalition is that as an alumna of the University of Chicago myself, I've found other U Chicago alumni, including Joanna and Edgar, who are here with us today. Today, we'll hear first from Representative Gene Wu, who's been a champion and ally in our fight against alien land laws. He'll talk about the intent behind these alien land laws, who are they impacting, and why you should care. He will also provide his insights about defeating the alien land law, SB 147 in Texas, and how grassroots organizing is so critical to defeat federal legislation such as the Rounds Amendment. Next, there will be a short policy discussion between Joanna, Edgar, and Ryan with an in-depth analysis of what's going on with the alien land laws, and namely the Rounds Amendment, and what we've done so far to fight back, so it won't become federal law in all 50 states. Next, there will be a Q&A discussion, and finally, ways for you to take action. Representative Wu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it is truly fantastic to see all of our ally organizations forming coalition. This is unfortunately it's taken this to do it, but it's so good to see everyone working together and pushing in the same direction. And that is something that I'm just so I feel so good seeing this. So look, we've been fighting this alien land law in Texas since the end of 2022, which is when we found out about it. And it would have been something that would have just snuck into law, but the governor ended up tweeting about it. And then people started looking, and then we suddenly discovered it. And we had the good fortune of discovering it early. And so for those of you who don't know the law, what it did was in Texas, there were multiple versions of it. The most prominent was SB 147. There were other versions of it in the House and in the Senate. Essentially what it does, and for anyone who doesn't know, is that it says because of where you're from, if you're an immigrant from these countries, you cannot purchase property, period. And that was later expanded to include also mineral rights and other types of property, which is just absurd. And the provisions basically said that if you're a citizen of one of these countries, meaning that that you are not a naturalized U.S. citizen, and for the Iranian community, it was more complicated because you have Iranian dual citizens who would have been affected by this as well. And basically saying, like, if you are a visa holder, if you're a green card holder, you're a permanent resident, or even if you're a dual citizen, but you happen to be a citizen of one of these dual citizen of one of these other countries, you can't buy property. You can't buy a business. You can't buy a house. You can't buy farmland for some reason. And at the end of the day, this is a type of discrimination that is, one, based on national origin, and two, is indiscriminate, meaning that people are being discriminated against and people are having their rights taken away for no reason, meaning that the government wouldn't have to prove that you did anything, that the government wouldn't have to prove that you were an agent of another country, that you committed a crime, or you did something that warranted having your rights restricted, but simply on the basis of where you're from. And that's it. And this is a type of legislation that we've seen many times before. And what's so infuriating for the Asian American community is that we've done this already. We've done this so many times. In fact, the timing of this legislation, it was almost 100 years exactly to the day when Texas passed the original alien land law that we passed in the early 1900s for the same reason, against the same people. And this has a long history. This type of legislation against Asian Americans has a long, long history, starting going all the way back to the gold rush days when California and other Western states all passed laws that said, like, Chinese people, Japanese people cannot own businesses. And you're only allowed to wash people's dirty clothes and make their food, and that's it. And you can't do anything else. And you don't have a right to own the property that your business is on, right? And then we move on a little further. We get to do the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Same purpose, same rationale, same reasoning, that these people are dangerous. They're that Asian Americans can never truly be American. So we have to restrict them. We don't want any more of these vermin coming in. And so we're going to deal with them. And then we fast forward a little bit more. We get states across the nation started passing their own version of alien land laws. In Texas, we passed alien land laws that said, the Chinese people who are moving into South Texas and who were buying farmland because they were farmers and that's all they knew how to do. And say, like, well, these people, obviously, there's something really different about them. Their language is really strange. They eat weird foods. And we don't think they can ever truly assimilate and become Americans. So we're going to go ahead and just say, like, you know what? We don't want this danger near our community and danger in our state. So we're going to say we're going to ban you from being able to purchase land and making a home here. We fast forward to World War II, and we in a different format, but we see the same type of rationale, same type of thinking. The United States was at war with Germany and Japan, but the United States government looked at one side of the country and said, well, obviously German Americans are Americans, and we trust that they're loyal to our country. And the American government only rounded up about 10,000 German nationals. But we looked at the other side of the country and said, well, there's something inherently different about those people with the yellow skin and the slanty eyes. And their language, nobody understands what they're saying. Their food is really strange. And we just don't think they can truly be Americans. And so we rounded up 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom, more than 66% of whom were American-born citizens. And because we said there's something inherently dangerous about Asian people. And we had the same type of things in the 1970s when we had economic issues with Japan, the murder of Vincent Chen, the same concept. It didn't matter if you were Japanese or Chinese or whatever you were. You looked Asian, and Asian people are inherently suspect. They're inherently threatening to our society, right? And we come all the way to 2023, and we have the same line of reasoning, the same thoughts that inherently there's something wrong with Asian Americans. We don't need to prove anything, just look at them. You can tell they're different. You can tell they're suspicious. Just look at the way they look. Just look at the way they talk. Let's look at the foods that they eat. There's something inherently suspicious about them. So this entire branch of law, this entire policy debate centers around this concept that Asian Americans are somehow inherently different than everyone else, that we're inherently more dangerous, inherently more threatening. We even saw it. I mean, we saw some of the same types of thinking during the Muslim ban, right? When we said these people from these countries, no matter what they've done, whether they're refugees or whether they're business people, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just look at them. They're dangerous. And it's the same type of thinking all over again. And that's why it's so dangerous for our entire community. And look, why is this? There's a question of why is this happening? Well, it's politics. And I don't want to be too partisan about this, but look, on the conservative side, on the Republican side, a lot of this came from ALEC. And ALEC decided that this is a good political ploy. And the Republicans across the United States have decided, you know what? We can pick on these people. And it's easy. And that leads us into sort of like, what should we do about it, right? And part of the reason why they chose Asian Americans, why they chose Iranian Americans, why they chose Chinese Americans, why they chose all Asian Americans is because our community looks like an easy target, right? Because they say, well, Asians, they don't really get angry. They don't really protest. They don't really scream and shout when things go wrong. So, what's the harm? And they say, well, Asians don't really vote. So even if they do get mad, what are they going to do? Right? And this type of thinking, this type of like, well, Asians are just good workers, right? Does that sound that might sound a little familiar? Sound a little familiar. So they're just good workers. They're very stoic. Blah blah blah. It plays all into the myth of the model minority, and so we have this policy based on one stereotype, and being pushed forward because of a belief in another stereotype, right? And that was our response, and our response from the community is how we got it to stop in Texas. So from the very beginning, we had massive response from the community. That the community, this spread like wildfire throughout the local communities and ethnic communities, not just in Chinese communities, but throughout all Asian communities. Right? We had protests, and we had press conferences, and we had more protests and more press conferences, and we made sure that it was in the media and in the know. But not just in the media, but we took great pains to make sure that the messaging and the record was correct. So in the very beginning, a lot of media covered it as, well, they just looked at the bill and just said verbatim, the bill says that it only affects citizens of other countries. What's the big deal? Right? And the media didn't think it was a big deal. Even liberal progressive readers said, well, what's the big deal? But then we said, like, hey, let's go correct that. Let's go talk to them and say, hey, you guys, you're a journalist, but you're not a lawyer. So do you understand that when they say citizens of other countries, that implies all immigrants? That implies visa holders, green card holders, even dual citizens who are immigrants. And they said, well, we didn't know that. And so we started correcting journalistic coverage, and we started like making that change in messaging. And once that message was changed in the media, that really changed public support, and it changed how outside people on the outside saw it, right? And for members of our own community who themselves may not be lawyers, they didn't really understand, because like a lot of our members of our community they read the bill, and they say like, I don't get it. I don't get what the big deal is. But once we go into our own communities and explain how this affects people and why, and the legal process of how they would do it, then all of a sudden people go, oh my gosh, that's the end for me, right? Because all of us, we all know people who have been green card holders for 10, 20, 30 years, because they say like, what's the big deal? Green card holder, you're just basically a citizen, but you can't vote and you don't have to serve on juries. So, people built entire business empires around here as green card holders, right? And then all of a sudden they say, well, that's the end of my business. Like, I can't do any more business here. So, and especially for the Iranian community, one of the big issues was Iranian Americans have dual citizenship, and often that has nothing to do with legality, but it has to do with the status of your parents' birth and their citizenship in Iran. So, and not only did the press not know that, the many people in the Iranian community did not know that, and more importantly, the elected officials did not know that, right? And having that conversation and having that change in the narrative made a huge difference. Look, so we had protests, we had press conferences, we talked to the media. Then the next big part of what we did, and some of y'all have been a part of, been on our town halls. We had weekly town halls to give updates of what's going on and provide directions to the community. And so we used Zoom as a way to organize the entire state. We had people mainly from Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and we talked to them about like, here are your marching orders. Contact your local official, contact your state rep, contact your senator. Call them, email them, text them, send them messages on social media, get out there and engage them, right? And people did this again and again and again. And they say, well, we've already contacted them once. Do it again, right? And if you're tired of sending them emails, then go find your family members who haven't sent an email yet, who haven't made a phone call yet, and get them to do it, right? And people did this over and over again, and people in offices got inundated with calls, and all of a sudden, the community that was supposed to be quiet, the community that wasn't supposed to make a big stink, the community that was just good little workers who never complained, they're out there in force, complaining and yelling and screaming. And more than that, right? Part of one of the more important messages was that of all the things that our community deals with, the message was, this is the line. This is the line in the sand. And for a lot of, I mean, I had a number of Republican Asian Americans and Republican Chinese who came to me and said, like, we can't do this law. I would have to move out of the state. I'd have to go somewhere else, or or whatever it is. And I said, well, you're a Republican. You donate. Why don't you go talk to them? Why don't you tell the people you donate to, if you pass this bill, if you vote for this bill, you will never see another check from me again. And we had Republicans willing to make that commitment to say, not only will I not give you a check, I will never vote for another Republican again. This is the line in the sand. One piece of great testimony during the Senate hearing was actually from a former Asian American Republican state rep who came to the legislature and told the Senate, hey guys, this is a bad idea. And not the least of which is there's a certain state rep out there who, if you pass this bill, he's going to beat you over the head with this in the Asian community over and over again. I was like, hey, that's me, right? But it doesn't just have to be me, but like it could be everyone. Go to those elected officials and say, if you do this, this is our line in the sand, right? Because this is an issue, an existential issue for our community. If you basically say that the American dream is dead for your community, what else is there? Why be in America? So anyways, having that threat of not only are we out there, not only are we mad and yelling, but we also say like there will be actual consequences. So that is the triumvirate of things that you need, right? So we're still fighting this in Texas. We defeated it in the regular session, but the governor has already indicated that he might put it on the special, but there's people asking for it special. This is a hardcore issue. This is now a like an important issue on the far right. And whether it's because it's of China, but whether it's because of COVID, well, all these things, people are on a tear to do this, right? And so we have to get ready. It's happening across the nation. Some states have done mild versions. Some states have defeated their bill. Some states have passed really horrible stuff, like Florida, right? They've gone out and just did the things that everyone said, no, that's terrible. And not only do we have to fight against it, but we have to organize in community. So the big things that we have to get together on is, one, we have to be coordinated in our campaigns and our messaging, and talk to people and be at the same protest and yell and scream. We have to contact our elected officials. But one really important thing is we also have to engage our community by voting. We have to get our community registered to vote and out to vote. And if people see our community out there, if they see voters, if they see an increase in voter registrations in our community, they might think twice. Okay. So I'm happy to take any questions, but I can do this for hours, but so.
Thank you so much, Representative Jinwoo, for your continued championship, fighting against this issue and fighting against these racist laws in Texas. We really appreciate your insight and support. I really loved how you provided the historical context from where these alien land laws came from. So I really wish there were more elected representatives like you. So thank you. So next we will go on to the policy and advocacy portion of the discussion. So our coalition has done a lot to fight against the Rounds Amendment on the federal level, which we will discuss on our policy and advocacy portion with Joanna Durman from AAJC, Edgar Chen from NAPABA, both UChicago alums, my fellow UChicago alums, and Ryan Costello from NIAC. I have some questions for our experts. This is on federal legislation. Can you explain to us what's the Rounds Amendment exactly? I know Representative Wu provided a lot of these historical context and the intent of these racist alien land laws. Now, where we are at with what is this Rounds Amendment, where we are at in the NDAA, also known as the National Defense Authorization Act, as well as other federal legislation related to land laws.
Thanks, Miriam. I can dive into that. I think that if you'll bear with me for a second, I want to zoom out so that people have some context for what the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, really is. And so briefly, the NDAA is the only bill that Congress has passed every consecutive year for over 60 years, which is a huge deal. It establishes policy and authorizes appropriations for the Department of Defense, nuclear weapons programs for the Department of Energy, and other defense-related activities related to national security. And the way that the NDAA process works typically is that the House passes its version of the NDAA, the Senate passes its version of the NDAA, and then if there are differences between those two versions, leadership appoints what are referred to as NDAA conferees. Which are basically just lawmakers who sit on particularly relevant congressional committees, whether that be the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, maybe the Financial Armed Services, or the House Financial Services Committee, maybe the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, whatever the case may be. These conferees get appointed and they get in a room, and their job is to figure out how to merge these two versions of the NDAA, again, one passed by the Senate and one passed by the House, into one version that then receives another vote in both chambers for approval before it gets sent to the president's desk to be signed. It is what I refer to as a Christmas tree bill because so many people want to tack on amendments to this National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, because again, it is the one thing that Congress reliably passes every single year. I've heard it been referred to as a Super Bowl for national security experts because these amendments can number in the hundreds, not thousands. So it is a big deal. Right now, at this current moment, we are in the conference process. So we are trying to resolve the differences between the House passed NDAA and the Senate passed NDAA. And unfortunately, there are a lot of provisions that we don't like in either bill. That conferees are considering. But chief among them is, of course, Amendment 813, introduced by Senator Rounds and adopted into the Senate version of the NDAA. And, I think it's very obvious for the people on this call what has been said already, that the organizations here oppose this amendment because it is in line with classic land law language that restricts property ownership based on national origin. Specifically, what the Rounds Amendment does is it requires the president to bar the sale of large-scale agricultural property to nationals from covered countries, including China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And I don't know that restrictions would apply to property that is greater than 320 acres or valued in excess of $5 million. We are currently we have developed and are currently implementing an advocacy campaign urging NDAA conferees to strike the Rounds Amendment from the conference entirely, to just take it out of the bill. I will note, though, that it is important context to know that we are in a bit of an uphill battle right now because the Rounds Amendment passed on a margin of 91-7 on the Senate floor. And so it's clear to us that the discriminatory impact that this could have on Asian American communities is something that we are also going to have to explain to Democratic offices. It is unfortunately something that has had thus far bipartisan support. So we know that this is an educational issue and an issue that we're going to have to bring to lawmakers again and again and again from the grassroots. A central part of our advocacy campaign thus far, of course, involves direct outreach to congressional offices. We've talked to Senator Durbin's office, Senator Stabenow's office, leadership on both HASC and SASC. We have put out press releases. We've issued social media roundups. We published op-eds. We have an action campaign on our website dedicated to opposing the Brown Amendment, and I can drop that in the chat or and make sure that it's included in the materials following this call. And of course, we have developed and transmitted to Congress organizational sign-on letters opposing the Rounds Amendment. Most recently, AJC sent a letter to NDAA conferees, again, asking folks to strike the amendment or to modify it in some way such that the bill only covers entities and corporations rather than individuals. And it has garnered a widespread support within the Asian American community. So we're encouraged to see that. Again, the goal of our advocacy is to get lawmakers to strike it entirely from the NDAA conference. But we also are realistic in the fact that, you know, if a version of the Rounds Amendment is ultimately adopted into law through this NDAA process, we want to be in the room to ensure that we are a part of the conversation that determines what that compromise language would be. And so we are having internal conversations amongst ourselves, amongst our organizations, our coalitions, to establish our policy bright lines. And those conversations are ongoing and are being transmitted to the appropriate staffers in the relevant committees. And then the very last thing that I'll mention here before handing it off is that there are certainly legislative efforts in place to address this onslaught of land law amendments or legislation more broadly on a federal scale. The Preemption of Real Property Discrimination Act, introduced by Representatives Chu and Green, would preempt state prohibitions of real estate purchases by foreign citizens. We're so thankful for this bill, but we're also reminded that we're facing what some have started to refer to as like legislative whack-a-mole, right? Where like when one thing like the Rounds Amendment comes up and you address it, it just pops up in another context on a federal level, whether or not that be the Farm Bill reauthorization, whether or not that be the House Appropriations Committee and bill and report. This stuff, this pervasive, harmful rhetoric and language is everywhere. And so it is just a reminder to be vigilant of this type of language cropping up in all spaces.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for that comprehensive overview of what we're up against. Again, there is a danger despite all of our efforts, coalition's efforts, there is a danger that this still might become law. So it's really up to us up to the, people like you in the audience to fight against this. And we will talk about that in a few moments. But first, I have another question. So we've talked a lot about alien land laws. We've talked about federal legislation, the Rounds Amendment, and also Representative Wu gave us a really good insight about what's going on locally. Someone tell us how many alien land laws have been introduced and passed around the country?
Hi, this is Edgar from NAPABA. Thank you so much for that question, and thank you to NIAC and to our coalition partners at AJC for being on this call, and thank you, Representative Wu, for championing civil rights for all. I think, as Joanna mentioned, it has been difficult to keep up with all the different bills that have been introduced. It is a game of whack-a-mole because these bills take different forms. Some focus on agricultural land. Some ban all foreigners, regardless of a country of origin. Others ban particular countries. We've seen legislation that targets, countries in particular, including just Chinese persons, for example. And some are silent. But we know that these restrictions on foreigners have been introduced in at least 34 states that we're aware of. At least 12 of them have passed, and we've seen at least 9 introduced in Congress. And what Representative Wu said was correct. Where we are aware, when we can organize, we can oppose these, but in a lot of these states that we've seen these introduced in, we don't have AANHPI legislators in those states to take up the mantle. We have been really fortunate to see other representatives at the state level, Black legislators, other legislators of color step up and advocate. But that also goes to the importance of, voting in state and local elections too, at that level, not just every 4 years.
Can I add just one quick thing? I mentioned, I meant to say this during my little spiel, but I think Edgar just brought up something that I think is really important, that some of our biggest allies in this fight are non-Asians. In states where there were no Asian American elected officials, African American legislators like stood up for us without even being asked, right? And I think that's really important because obviously, for the African American community, using property rights as a weapon is nothing new. And a lot of the coalition that we built around here involves Black, Hispanic, other groups, Jewish groups, Muslim groups, everybody. And I think it's really important for all of us to reach out, not just organize our own communities, but reach out to other communities and let them know we need your help and we want to help you. And we got to keep this strong and keep this going.
Thank you, Representative Wu. Ryan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think it's just, there's so much ground to fight. And we've really proven, I think, at this point that when we do show up and mobilize, and Texas was probably the biggest example of this, we can get some wins. Like that bill looked like it was going to sail to the governor's desk, but so many people showed up to, raise their concerns with it and really flag, look, this is national origin discrimination. This is a violation of my civil rights, and that bill was defeated there. In Florida, there was some mobilization and so forth. There were some changes that were made behind closed door, but at the end of the day, it's unacceptable. And we're able to mobilize a little bit in places like Louisiana to underscore our concerns. But the federal level, I think, is just so huge with the Rounds Amendment. And when I found out that it was going to be made in order for a vote in the Senate, I was a little bit surprised. The original version of this bill was just so clearly discriminatory. It had no protections, for U.S. citizens or for green card holders. They did add those protections into the Rounds Amendment, but we are still talking about one set of rules for one group of people and another set of rules for other people based on your national origin. This is clear discrimination. And, when we point these things out, I think there's a lot of sheepishness on the part of Democrats who support this, like, oh, yeah, you're right. We're going to have to fix that at some point in time. But there's a lot of issues that federal lawmakers are dealing with. And, there's so many different pieces of just the National Defense Authorization Act, this Christmas tree, as Joanna talked about. And if we don't show up and, make clear, hey, this is a priority and this language cannot be in the final bill, it's going to pass. Things sneak through all the time, particularly in big, must pass legislation like this. It was, during the Obama administration when, there were changes being made to the visa waiver program that essentially made it so that Iranian dual nationals and other dual nationals would not be able to go through the visa waiver program. And we said, hey, this is a slippery slope. If you enact these restrictions, who knows where they're going to lead? And sure enough, Donald Trump used those restrictions passed under the Obama administration with relatively, little attention amid a lot of xenophobic rhetoric with Trump announcing his Muslim ban and so forth. Trump used those and he targeted those same countries with his Muslim ban. So, that is one of the reasons why we are so involved in making sure that this discriminatory bills get stopped, that they get rolled back. And we really need to think beyond not just stopping the Rounds Amendment and not just stopping all these bills playing whack-a-mole around the country, but how do we get, Judy Chu and Al Green's bill, the Preemption of Real Property Discrimination Act, into law. Right now, it's got about 15 co-sponsors. There are a whole lot of bills that have around 15 co-sponsors. So we really need to get those numbers up. We need leadership to make it a priority and build political power so that it can wipe out all of these, discriminatory bills that have been enacted, across the United States.
Thank you so much, Ryan. The next question that I had is, we've talked about the state alien laws. We've talked a lot about the Rounds Amendment. What would happen if the Rounds Amendment became law? What if it passed as is? What if it became law as is right now in its original form? And what would be the immediate discriminatory effects?
Yeah, I can try to tackle that one. I think that, what Representative Wu said applies here. That's not a hypothetical question. That's not a theoretical question. You posed it as a what if, but we've already seen this. We've had at least a dozen states at the turn of the previous century pass similar alien land laws, mostly in the Mountain West and on the West Coast, that were targeted at Asian immigrants and farmland. Especially Japanese farmers buying land. That discrimination was based on around two premises, one being economic competition, and the second, a fear of potential fifth column of Japanese folks who were loyal to the emperor and empire and not their new homeland. So we've seen that. I think that the short answer is look to the history for what those discriminatory effects are on this agricultural bill. And the issue here is that the Rounds Amendment, not only in its intent, not only does it equate ordinary citizens of China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia on the same footing as state-owned companies in terms of its intent, we see that in the actual text of the language. There's no distinction between a Chinese or Russian, Iranian, North Korean state-owned company or government official or other entity that is potentially an agent of that government, and someone who is here lawfully present pursuant to a student visa or work permit, work visa here from those countries. That law makes no distinction, and therefore puts an ordinary person with, let's say, no ties, no membership in the Chinese Communist Party, or no ties to the Russian government, on the same footing with those governments. And that treatment, that legal treatment, codifies this perpetual foreigner syndrome. That because you're from there, your loyalty is there, and not to the United States.
Thank you, Edgar. Really appreciate that context. In addition to what we've outlined earlier, what else have we done so far to fight back against the Rounds Amendment? How have been your conversations on the Hill? Who wants to take that question?
I can start us off. I alluded to it a bit earlier, but a lot of it is just there's so much ground to cover in Congress. And so, we've been doing our August recess meetings and going up to the Hill and talking to them and raising the alarm. And most people have not heard of this amendment. They say, oh gosh, that sounds concerning. I'm going to have to look into it. Most people have not heard of the Chu Green bill that would wipe out these discriminatory bills at the state level. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Now, there are some, offices that are aligned with us and, have raised concerns about the Rounds Amendment in particular. Chris Van Hollen ended up voting for it, but, put a statement in the record that said, I have a lot of civil rights concerns with this, and we need to work out that language behind closed doors. There are other offices that I think are going to be working on the majority side to try to, mitigate these civil rights concerns, but we don't know if they're going to go far enough. We don't know if they're going to use their leverage effectively in order to protect all of our communities. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need to mobilize. We need to make sure that they know it's a priority. And strengthening it and protecting, visa holders from these countries.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Really appreciate the context and giving us more info about what we've done to fight against this bill, against this amendment. All right, so we have a lot of questions from the audience. This is I want to be very mindful of the fact of time. We're at 6:45 Eastern, 3:45 Pacific time. We want to make sure that we finish on time. So I will read out loud some questions from audience members like you. So the first question that we have is from the question I wanted to actually highlight is from Atessa. How does this extend to corporate entities, and how is their nationality determined? Does this apply to dual national non-immigrants such as Iranian Canadian? Who wants to answer that question?
So if the question is one of corporate entities, so non-natural persons, a company, usually some of these bills have defined that as if the company is incorporated or organized under the laws of either China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, or other states that are considered "quote unquote" adversarial countries, as determined by the Secretary of Commerce. And then for individual persons, the exceptions are you either have to have a green card or you have to be a U.S. citizen. You may hold dual nationality, dual citizenship with Iran, let's say, but as long as you're a U.S. citizen, you would be covered. Or if you have a green card, you may be exempt. But again, that excludes folks here on other lawfully present folks here in the U.S. on tourist visas, on student visas, on work visas, and asylees and refugees as well.
Thank you so much. The question I also have is from Bear in Maryland. This is an interesting one. Can you please address why is it bad to limit land property purchases by those who are not U.S. citizens or U.S. green card holders? I can understand 3 or 4 countries being singled out as being discriminatory, but what if the policy was to ban all non-resident or citizen purchases? Why should Saudi citizens or South African companies be allowed to buy American land if they are not U.S. citizens or resident aliens? Or perhaps create a reciprocal policy that only permits citizens of those countries friendly to American land property purchases?
So I'll try to address that. I mean, we had those same arguments back and forth. You know, when we had this bill in Texas, people said, "Well, you can't buy land in China if you're an American citizen." Well, that's not true, because nobody can buy land in China. Everyone has a 99-year lease, for one. And actually, if you're a resident, if you claim residency in China, you're actually allowed to purchase property. But that's not the point. The point is that the law in the United States is that everyone can purchase land, right? There's no restrictions on land purchases. In fact, the Texas Constitution, the Constitution of Texas, our Bill of Rights, the first thing it says in the Bill of Rights is that we may not discriminate based on national origin. It's in the Texas Constitution. It's like one of the first things in the Texas Constitution, right? And this whole concept of, well, why don't we treat people differently? That's the entirety of discrimination, right? Like we're not Saudi Arabia, we're not China, we're not any of those oppressive countries that treat people this way, and that is a good thing. If you're proud to be an American, then be proud to be an American. And our America is different than other places. We value people's freedom, we value people's rights, and we say those rights are invaluable based on individual traits that you cannot change. We do not discriminate against people based on the color of their skin, their ethnicity, their religion, and any number of other traits. And we're not supposed to. We do all the time, but people get sued and laws get struck down, right? And so the entirety of it, and if you want to know when is a law bad, when is a law racist, right? Here's the key. If you are saying we're going to take the rights away from people, and those people have done nothing wrong, and you don't have to provide any proof that they did something wrong, and you're saying just because of who you are, whether that's because you're gay, because you're Black, because you're Chinese immigrant, or any number of things that they cannot change, and they did not make a choice about, that's discrimination, that's racism, that's whatever you want to call it. That's how you can tell. The whole point of this is that Iranian Americans, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, whatever you have, all these people are just here. They're living their lives. They have done nothing. And without having to provide one scintilla of proof that they're a government agent, that they're a danger to our country, and or anything else, we're just going to say blanketly, because of where you came from, because of where you were born, we're going to say you're dangerous without any proof, right? We don't do that for anything else. Like when we take rights away from people who have committed crimes, we wait until they're convicted and we say, we're going to take away your right to freedom and put you in prison. And we're going to take your right, take away your right to vote and other stuff. But that's because there's something they did and then we proved it. Now, there's bills like the Virginia law, was like, we didn't like it, but it was less offensive. The Virginia said all people, all countries may not purchase property, not just any of these 3 or these 4 or 7, whatever the list is. All foreign nations cannot purchase property. That's it. And it only affected the governments and their agents, but left individuals alone, right? Because individuals have done nothing. And that's the key. And that is the primary focus on whether or not this is discriminatory.
One of the best lines I've heard was, I thought it was the Chinese Communist Party that was in the business of taking away people's property rights.
Yes. Exactly.
And then the other legal argument here is that our Constitution protects for, on the basis of national origin, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, a whole panoply of protections there. And so the short answer is these would be unconstitutional unless, as Representative Wu said, there is an articulatable or precise reason that you can narrowly tailor a prohibition to meet a particularized threat. And we haven't seen that. I don't think we've seen that. There's a fear out there, but I haven't seen the evidence of that threat. And I think that's really important. And the drafters of these bills have not articulated what that particularized threat is. They've talked about a fear that if a Chinese company buys land, they'll use it to spy on nearby military bases. I'm not sure that has come to pass yet.
But that kind of statement, I mean, that kind of like logic is exactly the same logic that was used against Japanese Americans during World War II, against Chinese Americans for the Chinese Exclusion Act, or all the other laws. Say, like, we don't need to prove anything. You guys are just inherently dangerous, right? Just because of the way you look, because of where you came from, you're inherently untrustworthy. And that's what we're fighting against. And this is why it's so important, because those kind of things stick with our community, right? Those kind of things, even we get past this hurdle of alien land laws, those types of discrimination, those types of stereotypes follow our community and will follow our communities for a long time. And either we push back against it now, or our great-grandchildren will be dealing with it.
Thank you so much. We have a couple more minutes for questions. I know we got a lot of questions, and I apologize again if we can't get to your question. I know that there's one other question as a follow-up to corporate entries, and there's also one on OFAC, which I want to get to. So the follow-up question to corporate entity is, could foreign nationals who are non-immigrants form a U.S. entity to buy land? In other words, is there no review of the nationality of the owners and shareholders, et cetera, of an entity? For frame of reference, analysis of nationality of owners is done in the context of USCIS or DOS adjudication. I'm just wondering whether, if any of these bills pass, there might be a workaround.
I think the short answer to that is it depends on the state, and it depends on what the state law says. There are state laws that do talk about ownership and investment. I can't give you the details off the top of my head, but they do sort of predict that there may be some sort of beyond a de minimis ownership stake by, let's say, a governmental agency in that company. And of course, state and corporation laws often do require beneficial ownership information. So they, if you want to incorporate in a certain state in the United States, you may need, depending on that state, to reveal the true owners of that company. But I think that's going to be a state-by-state analysis.
Thank you, Edgar. Another question is, if the idea is for national security purposes, why isn't the provision similar to those of OFAC and Bank Secrecy Act sufficient?
Because they're not really interested in national security. National security is a ruse, a guise, wolf in sheep's clothing kind of thing of let's find ways to discriminate. Because if you really wanted to address national security, it would not be at the state level. And this is the argument we've had in Texas, is like, you want a Department of Public Safety, the guys who patrol the highways, to monitor this. Like, do they have a CIA? Do they have an NSA? Do they have a military intelligence? Do they have an FBI? Like, what are you basing your intelligence on? How are you making decisions of who can or cannot own property? Are you just Googling stuff? Are you watching YouTube videos? And that's the frustration, is that they're using this shield of national security. Well, if we say it's national security, then no one will challenge us, right? And that's what it is. And I think we, as a community, need to say, we are absolutely interested in national security. We want to protect national security, but there's a right way to do national security, and there's definitely a lot of wrong ways to do it. And having states like Louisiana, what's Louisiana going to do with national security? They can barely keep water and power running. Okay. So, it's just one of those things. It's don't fall for it. Yeah. If you want to talk about national security, let's talk about beefing up CFIUS. Let's talking about putting extra funding on reviews, on all this other stuff, because 99.99% of all transactions are perfectly fine. Nothing will ever happen. And a state's not going to catch it. If you want to do national security, do it on the federal level.
I think that's exactly right. And one thing that Representative Wu also pointed out just now is that the Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States, also known as CFIUS, is something that already exists. I'm looking at the website right now. We can drop it in the chat. It's an interagency committee authorized to review certain transactions involving foreign investment in the U.S. and certain real estate transactions by foreign persons in order to determine the effect of such transactions on the national security of the U.S. And so if we want to talk about CFIUS reform, let's talk about CFIUS reform. I have not talked to any office who would have an issue with that. I don't think I personally would have an issue with CFIUS reform, but let's actually address it where it would be effective and where it doesn't target specifically and seek out individuals.
And that's how you know that they're not serious about national security, because that's where the actual national security is. Right.
Yeah. And what you don't want is a hodgepodge or a patchwork of a certain state saying that these are our, parameters or criteria for determining what's a national security threat that affects a U.S. military base in North Dakota. And that is at a different standard than what Florida does, and a different standard than what the Secretary of State in Texas under the Lone Star Infrastructure Protection Act may determine, right? You don't want that hodgepodge. And so I think that's right, that they're not serious about national security. It's rhetoric. And I have to say also, we will hear this line a lot. These bills don't target Asian Americans. They target the Chinese Communist Party. But read the bill. It singles out individuals who are not members of the Chinese Communist Party. So you got to call them on their BS by reading the bill, understanding it, and whom it affects.
Thank you so much to all of our wonderful experts here in answering the audience's questions. I learned a lot already myself from you all. I just also want to reiterate what's at stake here. As Representative Jean Wu and our fellow panelists here today have said, your right to buy property and pursue the American dream is in danger. The Rounds Amendment will become federal law if we don't stop it. Under a Republican president, we already had our first Republican debate a couple weeks ago. And if we have a Republican majority in one or both chambers, this could affect dual citizens and green card holders as well, beyond just visa holders who are already being impacted and targeted already. No one, absolutely no one should be discriminated against on the basis of their immigration status and national heritage. So here's what you can do as ordinary citizens to take action. And this is very urgent. First, call your Congress members, asking them to reject the Rounds Amendment from the NDAA. Right now is a very critical time because, as Joanna said, all the senators are back in DC, here in DC, and they're in conference right now, and the Rounds Amendment is one of the top issues. We need them to make sure that you call your senators to urge them to vote no and to say no and reject the Rounds Amendment. And the link will be in the chat right now. So you can call your senators if you want to do more. The second is send letters to your Congress members against Rounds. We have a quick action alert. I know my colleague dropped it in the chat earlier. You can send it to your representatives with a few easy clicks. You don't have to write anything. The script is already in there. Just a few clicks and it will be sent to your both House and Senate representatives. The third thing that you can do is organize rallies. As Representative Wu said in Texas, grassroots and being vocal and organizing rallies and protests is very important. So we have one of our coalition partners, United Chinese Americans. They've been organizing a lot of these rallies in Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. So we're going to drop Stephen Pay's email in the chat. He has been the one who has been organizing all of these local rallies in Texas and Florida. So if you want to organize a local protest in your area near you, at your street corner, right in front of your district, the district offices of your congressional representatives, those all make a huge difference. Talk to Stephen. His email will be in the chat. The third thing that you can do is donors. We have a lot of rich people in our communities. If you can write to your Republican lawmakers in your states saying that if you won't write checks or vote for them again if they support these racist policies. So you will not write checks for them or vote for them if they support these racist policies. Again, as we mentioned before on this call, voting is very important. Writing checks is important. Withholding votes and checks is a big game changer in all of this. Another thing you can do, write op-eds in your local newspapers about the dangerous trend of alien land laws happening around the country and why you are angry about it as an ordinary citizen. If you want to write an op-ed, feel free to email me at msabaghi@nyackcouncil.org and we can work with you on it. As we mentioned earlier on this call, our national coalition partners, NIAC and AJC, we had a joint op-ed. We've been doing this. Been doing these op-eds at the national level. We need to see more of this at the local level. A lot of these alien land laws. This is the final thing asked for you to do. A lot of these land laws, alongside anti-abortion and anti-LGBTQ laws, have been introduced and or passed and have been passed in state legislators. As Edgar mentioned earlier, we've seen Democrats in New York and California introduce alien land law bills. So it's not just a red state issue, it's also blue state issues. And it's coming for you if it hasn't already. These laws, alien land laws, directly harm our communities. And we've observed that a lot of us don't know in all of this process how state legislatures work and how we can make an impact in that process. So we have a state legislators 101 training in October that will teach you the basics of how state legislatures work. Sign up in the link shared in the chat. And hopefully by October, we will have blocked the Rounds Amendment. Thanks to you all. Again, thank you so much for all the speakers, Representative Wu, our coalition partners, my colleagues at NIAC. Thank you all so much for your support and for sharing your insight analysis on this very urgent issue. And thank you to the audience for joining us this Tuesday evening. We really appreciate it. The resources that will be emailed to you for the above actions you can take. Thank you so much and have a good evening. Thank you all.